Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Christmas Eve always had a way of making everything feel a little more fragile, like the warmth in the air was just thinly veiled tension waiting to snap. The house smelled of cinnamon and roasted turkey, the fireplace crackled softly in the background, and the table was set to perfection: crystal glasses, polished silverware, my mother's best china. Everything was just as it had always been, meticulously arranged to present the illusion of a perfect family. But underneath it all, the same unspoken rules applied. Emily was the golden child, the favored one, the one who always got the biggest slice of everything, while I was simply expected to be fine with whatever crumbs were left behind. I watched as my mother fussed over Emily, straightening the bow on her sweater as though she were still a child, pouring her another glass of wine, laughing too hard at a joke that wasn't even funny. My father, as always, listened attentively to her stories, nodding along like she was the most interesting person in the room. Meanwhile, I sat at the far end of the table, sipping my drink quietly, waiting for the inevitable moment when the night would turn into another reminder of just how little I really mattered in this family. Ryan, my husband, caught my eye from across the table, his expression calm but knowing. He'd seen this dynamic play out countless times before, had listened to me vent about it after too many long family dinners. And yet, even now, after years of marriage, he still seemed quietly fascinated by just how blatant it was. He leaned in slightly, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "They're really laying it on thick tonight," he murmured, his lips barely moving. I exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking my head slightly. "It's Christmas," I replied. "Gotta keep the tradition alive." The evening dragged on, conversation flowing in the same predictable currents it always did. Emily's business, Emily's accomplishments, Emily's struggles. When I spoke, my words seemed to land like background noise, acknowledged with polite nods before the conversation inevitably drifted back to her. It wasn't even worth getting upset about anymore. I had long since accepted that, in my parents' eyes, I was simply the self-sufficient one, the daughter who didn't need their attention or support because I had somehow managed to build a life without them. And maybe, once upon a time, that had hurt. But tonight, all I felt was a strange sort of detachment, like I was watching everything unfold from a distance, waiting for the inevitable moment when they would remind me, explicitly or otherwise, that Emily's success was more important than mine. And then it happened. My mother cleared her throat, setting down her wine glass with a small, satisfied smile. My father reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a slim white envelope, holding it out toward Emily with a look of quiet significance. Emily blinked in surprise, setting down her fork as she took the envelope, glancing between them uncertainly. "What's this?" she asked, her fingers carefully peeling back the flap. My father exhaled, his expression gentle but serious. "It's something we've been thinking about for a long time," he said, glancing at my mother, who nodded along in agreement. "Your business has been going through a rough patch, and we know how hard you've been working to keep it afloat." Emily's brow furrowed slightly as she pulled out the check, her eyes scanning the numbers written across it. And then, just for a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "We put all of the inheritance into your business," my mother said, her voice warm with reassurance. "You need it more than anyone." A silence settled over the table, heavy and suffocating. I stared at the check in Emily's hand, my mind struggling to process the words that had just been spoken. All of the inheritance. Every last cent. Given to Emily. Because she needed it more. Ryan set his fork down with an almost deliberate slowness, his expression unreadable. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, the quiet, simmering fury that had been buried for so many years suddenly roaring to the surface. But before I could even find the words to respond, Ryan leaned back in his chair, his lips curving into the smallest, sharpest of smirks. "Well," he said, his voice slow and measured, "good thing we didn't need it." Emily looked up sharply, her expression shifting from excitement to confusion. My parents frowned, glancing between Ryan and me with matching looks of unease. Ryan exhaled a small chuckle, reaching for his wine glass as he met Emily's gaze head-on. "We just bought the company you work for," he said, his voice light, almost amused. "Merry Christmas." And just like that, the entire night changed. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint crackling of the fireplace, the distant clatter of a dish being set down in the kitchen, and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Emily sat frozen, her fingers clenched tightly around the check, her knuckles white against the pale envelope, her mouth slightly open as though she wanted to say something but had momentarily forgotten how to form words. My parents, who had only seconds ago been basking in the glow of their own generosity, now wore identical expressions of unease, their eyes darting between Ryan and me as if hoping that, at any second, one of us would suddenly burst into laughter and reveal this was all some kind of elaborate joke. Ryan remained utterly composed, his fingers drumming idly against the rim of his wine glass, his smirk lingering just long enough to let the weight of his words sink into the stunned silence around us. Emily blinked once, then again, her confusion giving way to something much sharper, much colder, a slow-moving panic creeping across her face as the implications of what he had just said began to unfold in her mind. My mother was the first to break the silence, her voice pitched slightly higher than usual, a forced laugh tumbling out of her lips like she was trying to smooth over something deeply uncomfortable. "Now, hold on a second," she said, her gaze shifting rapidly between Ryan and me, as though searching for some sort of explanation that would make everything feel less ominous. "What do you mean you bought the company? Emily's company? That doesn't make any sense." Ryan took his time before answering, deliberately reaching for his wine glass and taking a slow sip, letting the moment stretch out until my mother's forced smile began to falter at the edges. He finally set the glass down with an almost theatrical ease, tilting his head slightly before speaking. "It makes perfect sense," he said smoothly, his tone so calm it was almost condescending. "The acquisition was finalized about a week ago. We saw an opportunity and took it. That's how business works." Emily finally found her voice, though it was hoarse and strained, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as though she needed to hold onto something solid to keep from slipping under the weight of what she was hearing. You bought it?" she repeated, her words coming out uneven, like she was struggling to push them past the lump forming in her throat. "Why the hell would you do that?" I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, my voice softer but no less certain. "Because it was a smart investment," I said simply, watching as the reality of the situation started to truly sink in for her. "And because we could." My father's expression darkened, his usual patience thinning as he shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around his fork. "Now, hold on just a minute," he said, his tone carrying that same authoritative weight he had always used when trying to put me in my place. "Emily has been working her ass off to keep that company afloat. She's poured everything into it. That business means everything to her." I didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't even blink. "And that's exactly why we bought it," I replied, my voice unwavering. "Because she was hanging by a thread, and we saw the writing on the wall. It was only a matter of time before someone else stepped in, and if it wasn't going to be us, it would have been someone who didn't give a damn about her future." Emily let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a sob, her free hand pressing against her forehead as she shook her head in disbelief. This is unbelievable," she muttered, her voice shaking with barely restrained anger. You knew I was in trouble, and you let me think I was getting help, only to pull the rug out from under me like this." I tilted my head slightly, watching her carefully, my own heartbeat steady and unshaken. "You think I let you think you were getting help?" I asked, arching an eyebrow. "Funny, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you were just expecting to be bailed out without ever once considering that maybe someone else deserved a chance for once." Her breath hitched, her eyes darting toward our parents in some desperate attempt to find support, but even they looked uncertain now, their carefully curated illusion of fairness unraveling at the seams. My mother opened her mouth as though she wanted to argue, but no words came out, and my father merely exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Emily's lips trembled slightly before she hardened her expression, a defensive anger flickering across her features as she leaned forward, her hands clenched into fists on the table. "You set me up," she hissed, her voice laced with pure venom. "You planned this, didn't you? You knew exactly how this was going to play out, and you let me walk right into it like some idiot." Ryan let out a small, amused chuckle, shaking his head slightly as he met her glare head-on. "Oh, sweetheart," he murmured, his tone light but dripping with mock sympathy. "You don't even know the half of it." And just like that, whatever fragile control Emily had left shattered completely. There are moments in life when the past collides so violently with the present that you can almost hear the echoes of old conversations ringing in your ears, reminders of who you were always expected to be and who you refused to become. Sitting at that dinner table, watching my sister tremble with barely contained rage while my parents looked at me as though I had just set fire to everything they held sacred, I felt something shift deep inside me. Something that had been buried under years of forced silence and quiet resentment. This moment had been building for a long time, a slow and steady accumulation of choices, of sacrifices, of battles fought in the shadows of a family that never truly saw me as one of their own. I thought back to the countless times I had sat in that very same chair, listening as my parents praised Emily's achievements while barely acknowledging my own, acting as though my success was inevitable while hers was something fragile that needed constant reinforcement. I remembered how, when we were kids, Emily always had the best of everything: the newest clothes, the most expensive extracurricular activities, the private tutors who ensured she never fell behind in school. While I was expected to figure things out on my own, to make do with whatever was left over after they had finished ensuring her success. It wasn't even that they disliked me, it was that they had decided, long before either of us had a chance to prove them wrong, that Emily needed them more than I ever would. I learned early that there was no point in asking for things that were never going to be mine, no sense in hoping for the kind of unwavering support that had been reserved exclusively for my sister. While she had doors held open for her at every turn, I had to force mine open with sheer determination, had to build something out of nothing with no one to catch me if I fell. And fall I did, more times than I could count, but I always got back up, always found a way forward, always kept going because I had no other choice. Ryan and I had built our success from the ground up, had sacrificed sleep, comfort, and any semblance of an easy life to create something that was truly ours. We never once relied on my parents, never once asked for their approval or validation, never expected them to acknowledge what we had accomplished. And yet, even now, even after everything, it was clear that they still believed Emily was the one who deserved more, that she was the one whose struggles mattered, that my success was something that required no recognition because they had never once considered it anything more than a fluke. Emily let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head as she finally found the words she had been searching for, her voice shaking with a mixture of fury and desperation. "You did this on purpose," she accused, her fingers gripping the edges of the check as though she wanted to tear it in half, but couldn't bring herself to destroy the only thing she had left. "You waited until I was at my lowest, and then you swooped in like some vulture just to watch me crash and burn." I exhaled slowly, watching her with an expression that was far calmer than I felt, tilting my head slightly as I considered my response. "I didn't do anything to you," I said, my voice steady and even despite the storm brewing just beneath the surface. "You did this to yourself. You ran that company into the ground, made bad decisions, ignored every warning sign, and assumed that when things got bad enough, someone would be there to save you. But guess what, Emily? The only reason you ever thought you were untouchable was because Mom and Dad always made sure you were." My mother gasped as though I had physically struck her, her hand flying to her chest in some dramatic display of wounded disbelief, while my father scowled, his jaw tightening as he prepared to insert himself into a conversation he had no right to be a part of. "That is not fair," my mother snapped, her voice sharp with outrage, her gaze darting toward my father for support. "You have always been strong, always been independent, always been able to handle things on your own. Emily has always needed more help, more guidance, more of everything," I interrupted, my tone sharper than I intended, my patience unraveling at the seams. She always needed more, and you always gave it to her, no matter how much it cost, no matter how many times you had to take from me to make sure she never had to struggle. I shook my head, something dark and cold settling in my chest as I let out a small, humorless laugh. And look where it got her. You spent your whole lives trying to make sure she never had to face the real world, and the second things got difficult, she fell apart. Emily's eyes widened in pure fury, her fingers tightening into fists as she leaned forward, her voice rising in an almost desperate attempt to turn the narrative in her favor. You don't get to act like the victim here, she spat, her face flushing with a mixture of anger and humiliation. You're sitting here, throwing this in my face like you didn't spend years resenting me for something that was never my fault. I didn't choose to be the favorite, I didn't ask for it, and I sure as hell never did anything to hurt you. I let out a slow breath, studying her for a long moment before leaning back slightly, my expression unreadable. No, you didn't, I admitted, my voice quiet but firm. You just never cared enough to notice how much it hurt. A silence settled over the table, heavier than before, thick with something that felt dangerously close to finality. My parents sat rigid in their seats, their expressions unreadable, their carefully constructed image of fairness shattered beyond repair. Emily opened her mouth to say something else, to fight back, to argue, but I could see it in her eyes. She already knew she had lost. And then, just when she thought it couldn't get any worse, I delivered the final blow. You might want to start looking for a new job, I said, my voice so calm it almost sounded gentle. Because when the transition finalizes next week, your position will no longer exist. Emily's breath hitched, her eyes widening in pure horror as the weight of those words settled deep into her chest. And for the first time in my life, I watched as my sister, the golden child, the one who had always been protected from consequences, the one who had been given everything, finally realized what it felt like to lose. The moment my words landed, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted from tense disbelief to full-blown chaos, as if I had just upended the entire foundation of what my family believed to be true. My mother gasped so loudly it almost sounded rehearsed, pressing a hand to her chest as though I had personally struck her, while my father's face darkened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table with barely restrained fury. Emily sat there frozen, her mouth opening and closing in silent protest, her eyes darting wildly between me and Ryan, as if waiting for someone to suddenly reveal that this was all some cruel, elaborate joke meant to humiliate her. That is completely unacceptable. My father finally exploded, his deep voice echoing through the dining room with the same authority he had always wielded over me as a child, the same voice that had once made me shrink back in submission. You can't just throw your own sister out of a job like she's nothing. Have you lost all sense of family, of basic decency? Do you even understand what you've done? Ryan let out a quiet chuckle, swirling the remaining wine in his glass before taking a slow sip, his posture relaxed in stark contrast to the growing panic gripping the rest of the table. I think the better question, he said smoothly, setting his glass down with deliberate ease, is whether you understand what you've done. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks an awful lot like you spent Emily's entire life shielding her from reality, and now that it's finally caught up to her, you're expecting someone else to fix the mess you helped create. Emily let out a strangled sound somewhere between frustration and desperation, shaking her head violently as her hands clenched into fists on the table. This isn't fair, she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of humiliation and rage, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You can't just take everything away from me. You don't need that company, you don't need the money, you're just doing this to punish me. To make me suffer because you've always been jealous? I repeated, laughing despite the deep ache rising in my chest, despite the exhaustion of years spent trying and failing to make them see me as anything more than an afterthought. Jealous of what, exactly? Of the way our parents always bent over backward to make sure you never had to struggle? Of the way they always found an excuse for every mistake you made, every bad decision, every failure, while I had to claw my way to success with no one in my corner. You want to talk about fairness, Emily? Let's talk about fairness. Where was fairness when they paid for your college tuition while I had to work 3 jobs just to keep up with my student loans? Where was fairness when they bought you your first car while I took the bus for years? Where was fairness when every Christmas, every birthday, every family event revolved around making sure you felt special while I was expected to sit quietly in the background and be grateful for whatever scraps of attention I managed to get? My mother let out a choke sound, her face pale with shock, as if she had never once considered that I might have been keeping track of all the ways they had chosen her over me. My father's jaw tightened, his nostrils flaring as if he was preparing to argue, but I could see it in his eyes, the flicker of something dangerously close to guilt, the realization that I was speaking a truth he had spent my entire life ignoring. "That's not," my mother started, shaking her head in disbelief, but my father cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand, his gaze burning into me with something much colder, much more calculating. "You were always fine on your own," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm, and it was in that moment that I realized there was no misunderstanding, no grand miscalculation on their part. This had been their plan all along. Emily needed us more. She was always the one who struggled, the one who had to work harder just to keep up. "We thought you understood that." A cold, hollow silence stretched between us, the final nail driven into the coffin of whatever illusion I had once held about my place in this family. My father wasn't apologizing, wasn't making excuses, wasn't trying to soften the blow. He was simply stating a fact, as if I was supposed to nod my head and accept that I had never been meant to matter in the way that Emily did. And maybe, once upon a time, that truth would have shattered me, would have sent me spiraling into the same quiet, desperate need for their approval that had defined so much of my life. But not tonight. Emily turned to me again, her voice raw, her hands reaching out as though she could physically pull me back into the role of the quiet, obedient sister who had always let her win. "Please," she whispered, and for the first time all evening, I could hear the sheer, unfiltered panic in her voice. "You don't have to do this. You could fix this if you wanted to. You could find another position for me. You could let me keep my job. You could," but I didn't let her finish. I picked up my napkin, folded it carefully, and placed it beside my plate with slow, deliberate movements, taking my time before standing up and smoothing out the wrinkles in my dress. When I finally looked up, I met her gaze without hesitation, without a single ounce of the uncertainty that had plagued me for so many years. "No, Emily," I said, my voice steady, my words sharp enough to cut through the air between us like a blade. "I could have, but I won't." I turned to my parents then, watching as their expressions hardened, as my mother's lips pressed into a thin line and my father's gaze darkened with barely restrained fury. They had made their choice a long time ago, and now, for the first time, I was making mine. I reached for my coat, sliding it over my shoulders with the same calmness that had settled deep into my bones, the kind of certainty that came from finally understanding where I stood. Ryan pushed his chair back with a quiet scrape against the floor, his movements unhurried as he followed my lead, his hand resting lightly against my lower back as we made our way toward the door. I paused only once, my fingers grazing the doorknob as I turned back toward them, letting my gaze sweep over their stunned, furious, broken faces one last time. Then I smiled, slow and deliberate, and let the final words slip from my lips like a quiet, undeniable truth. "Merry Christmas." And then I walked out, leaving them scrambling for the scraps of a reality they had never once prepared themselves to face. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of Christmas music playing softly in the background, the glow of the tree casting warm golden light across the living room as I sank into the couch, exhaling a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The weight of the evening still clung to me, the echoes of raised voices and shattered illusions ringing in my ears, but beneath the exhaustion, there was something else, something steady, something resolute, something that felt suspiciously like freedom. Ryan sat beside me, his arm draped casually over the back of the couch, his fingers tracing absent-minded patterns against my shoulder as he watched me with quiet amusement, the same knowing smirk still lingering at the edges of his mouth. "They'll call," he murmured after a long stretch of silence, his voice low, confident, utterly unsurprised by how everything had unfolded. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but they will. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head slightly as I leaned back against the cushions, letting my gaze drift toward the tree, the twinkling lights reflecting off the glass ornaments, the scent of pine and cinnamon filling the air. You think so? I asked, though we both already knew the answer. Ryan tilted his head slightly, giving me a look that was equal parts amusement and certainty, the kind of expression he always wore when he was waiting for the inevitable. They have no choice, he said simply, stretching his legs out in front of him as though he had never been more comfortable in his life. They never thought they'd need you, but now they do. And that's the part they can't stand. As if on cue, my phone buzzed against the coffee table, the sharp vibration breaking the quiet stillness of the room. I didn't move at first, just stared at the screen as the name flashed across it, the familiar weight of expectation pressing against my chest even as I felt something inside me shift, something that had been waiting for this exact moment my entire life. Emily. Ryan glanced down at the phone, letting out a soft chuckle as he reached for his drink, taking a slow sip before giving me a sideways glance. Told you, he murmured, entirely unsurprised. I let the phone ring twice more before finally reaching for it, pressing it to my ear without bothering with any pleasantries, waiting for her to speak first, knowing that whatever she had to say, it wouldn't change anything. There was a beat of silence on the other end, the sound of her uneven breathing filling the space between us, and for the first time in my life, Emily sounded small, smaller than I had ever imagined possible. I don't know what to do, she admitted finally, her voice cracking in a way that made it clear she had spent the last few hours cycling through every stage of grief, from anger to disbelief to whatever fragile acceptance she had now stumbled upon. You don't understand, I need this job. I need something. You can't just leave me with nothing. I inhaled slowly, pressing my fingers against my temple as I let the words settle between us, my mind already mapping out the next inevitable steps, the same way I always had. Emily had never had to think 3 moves ahead, had never had to anticipate consequences, had never had to wonder what came next, because there had always been someone to catch her when she fell. But this time, for the first time, she had finally run out of safety nets. You have 2 choices, I said evenly, my voice steady in a way that made it clear there would be no room for negotiation, no space for another favor, no chance for her to manipulate her way back into the position she had always taken for granted. You can either come work for me, or you can find another job. That's it. Those are your options. The silence that followed was so long I almost thought she had hung up, but then I heard the sharp inhale, the barely concealed tremor of humiliation in her voice. You want me to work for you? She whispered, and I could hear the sheer agony in the way she forced herself to even consider the possibility, the weight of what that meant settling so heavily on her shoulders that I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. You need to work for me, I corrected, my tone devoid of sympathy, my patience long since burned away. Because no one else is going to hire you after what happened to that company, and you know it. The industry is small, Emily. You've burned every bridge without even realizing it, and by the time you do, it'll be too late. Her breathing hitched again, and for a brief moment, I could almost feel the sheer humiliation radiating through the phone, the gut-wrenching realization that she would never again be the person she thought she was, that she would never again stand above me. That for the rest of her life, she would always be beneath me now. I'll think about it, she whispered finally, and it was the closest thing to surrender I had ever heard from her. I didn't say anything else, didn't offer her comfort or reassurance, didn't tell her that it would be okay, because for once, this wasn't my problem to fix. Instead, I simply reached forward and ended the call, setting the phone back down on the coffee table with a quiet finality, exhaling slowly as the last remnants of whatever power she had once held over me dissolved into nothing. Ryan watched me carefully, waiting for my reaction, but I just leaned back against the couch, letting my gaze drift back to the Christmas tree, the twinkling lights casting soft patterns across the ceiling. This year, for the first time, I wasn't just enduring another holiday, wasn't just sitting through another reminder of where I stood in this family. This year, I hadn't just gotten revenge. I had gotten justice. The room was quiet again, the kind of quiet that felt more like peace than silence, the kind of quiet I had spent my entire life chasing without even realizing it. And then, just as I was starting to let myself enjoy it, my phone buzzed again, the name flashing across the screen sending a familiar chill down my spine. Mom. I hesitated for only a second before glancing at the preview of the message, my lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile, wasn't quite a frown, something that settled somewhere in the space between satisfaction and inevitability. You ruined everything. I exhaled slowly, rolling my shoulders back as I stared at the words, feeling the weight of them, the finality of them, the sheer desperation behind them. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to argue, didn't feel the need to explain, didn't feel the need to prove that I had done anything other than what was necessary. Because maybe I had ruined everything. Or maybe, just maybe, I had finally won.